Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. Thank you all for joining us on this sunny afternoon. We will do our utmost best to stick within the 1 hour time frame. Some people will still join us, but I suggest we already do the introduction part. So my name is Steven Kouwenbergs. I'm a partner within BDO Belgium in the Risk Advisory Service line. Next to myself, we have two other presenters for today. The first is my colleague Sam, a manager also in BDO Belgium. And last but not least, we have our honored guest speaker, Mr. Dan Campan, who is the General Director for CERT Romania. He's also a reference when it comes to cyber risk management, but I'll let him introduce himself just after my brief introduction. First, maybe a few words about the setup of this webinar. In order to keep a structured flow during the presentation, you can write any questions you have in the Q&A box, and our colleague Wart will take care of this. At the end of the webinar, we will come back to these questions and try to answer them as good as possible. Specific questions can also be covered offline, of course, at a later stage. So today we will be talking about CROE, or Cyber Resilience Oversight expectations. Topics that will be covered during the webinar include a brief overview of cyber and regulatory trends, a few words on the framework itself, of course. Subsequently, we will look into main findings of recent inspections by regulators, and we will also cover a pragmatic approach towards CROE. And we will wrap up with some key success factors. I will now pass the floor to our guest speaker in Bucharest. Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I hope you can hear me very well. With your permission, I suggest that we go to the next slide, because I would like to share with you, with the participants, a bit of regulatory view. So my organization is the Cybersecurity Authority at national level in Romania. So we act also as a cybersecurity incident response team, but we are also a regulator. So for everything that means cybersecurity, for all the domains that are covered by the NIS directive and by some Romanian law, including banking, including financial market infrastructure, transportation, healthcare, etc. And of course, from this perspective, we have to focus on the entire cybersecurity domain. So one element that we observe, and that's common knowledge, common practice, and from a regulator perspective, from a national competent authority perspective, it's a huge attention point, is the fact that, of course, the financial sector as a whole, with all the key actors, including payment institutions of any kind, form, and shape, banks, insurance companies, and so on, they are all subject to intense cyber attacks. One of the analysts, as you can see on the screen, actually stated that financial service firms are actually much more targeted than any other categories of companies by cyber attackers. It's something that I can confirm. We see it from the perspective of a Romanian national authority. We see it by means of sensors that we deployed in networks, in infrastructures. We see it by means of notifications that we receive every day. So via all the mechanisms and tools that we have at national level for financial sector, we observe pretty much the same. There is no other sector that today it's subject to attacks, is subject to smaller or larger scale incidents. And of course, from a regulatory perspective at national level, but also in coordination with the Romanian National Bank, we pay special attention to the actors in the industry. We pay special attention to the way they are prepared or the way they respond to those cyber attacks. Next slide, please. I wanted to share with you some statistics coming from Romania that you may know it's a market of about 22 million citizens. Actually, what we noted, and these are real life figures coming from our systems, from our sensors. Actually, out of the total number of incidents, which is huge, as you can expect, at national level, about 12% is really the banking sector. So it's more than any other sector by far. Much more than transportation, much more than drinking water, much more than energy. Also, of course, financial market infrastructure are impacted as well. It's a bit smaller than the banking, but all in all, if we counted by month, by year, by quarter, by week, by any criteria, any time frame, by far this sector is the most impacted, subject to attacks, where many of the incidents are reported. And I wanted to mention something to you, to this audience. What we did in Romania, actually, I succeeded together with my team to put together actually all the banks operating in Romania to really use a common platform. We just piloted it. Actually, in 2 days from now, we'll meet all the banks registered in this country and have them sharing information about incidents, about indicators of compromise, about attack vectors and so on the same operational platform. So it's a first for us here, and indicates a bit the level of interest from a national cybersecurity authority towards the banking sector. So myself, I come from the consulting world. I took over the lead of this national authority 2 months ago, but it's a top priority, and everything that I discuss with my correspondents, my peers in other countries, Belgium, Germany, Austria, France, etc., they all tell me the same thing. It's strong focus from a regulatory perspective, from a national competent authority, cybersecurity competent authority, towards the banking, the financial sector. Next slide, please. Don't mind. Okay. One element that I wanted to share also with you, because we see the complexity and the sophistication of those attacks, it's just increasing. So day by day, week by week, the nature and the level of preparation of those attacks, it's increasing. And I was wondering why. Because from an attacker perspective, of course, the first trend is really to try to use, let's say, the most cost-effective, the cheapest way to attack a bank, to exploit their vulnerabilities, or to attack a payment provider, a payment processor. And we're wondering, and we're trying to analyze why the level of sophistication and complexity is increasing. And surprise, the answer is quite straightforward. It's increasing because also the level of maturity and the level of measures that are put in place by the actors in the financial sector are increasing as well. So financial sector infrastructure players, or payment providers, or banks, etc., they grow in their maturity. They are more and more subject to scrutiny from the regulators. They receive a lot of questions. The level of expectations towards their maturity is also increasing. So it's a bit of cat and mouse game between the ones that are in charge with information security, with cyber security in their organizations, expectations from the regulators, but also the level of preparedness and determination of the bad actors, of the malicious actors. So we see this going on and on and on. And that's something that I guess you observe it also in your own organizations, and is not going to decrease this trend. So I think we just continue to increase for the future as well. Next slide, please. So actually, one important element that I'm sure most of you are already pretty much aware of, and you are looking into it, if not yet. It's how the regulators at European level, like the European Central Bank, how they tackle the challenge of ensuring an adequate level of cybersecurity for the key actors in the financial sector. So there are several pillars, as you can expect, on ensuring this preparedness, on supporting everyone. Today we are going to talk a bit with the help of the colleagues from BDO on the pillar number 1, which actually and technically it's focusing on 2 particular mechanisms to support everyone, to support you guys in getting better cybersecurity level in your own organization. So first is the CROE, the Cyber Risk Oversight Expectation Framework, that I must say, from the perspective of Romania, that you may be aware, Romania is not member of the Eurozone. So technically, what happened when I discussed with the Romanian banks, they are like, hey Dan, we are very sorry, you are the national authority, you are the regulator on cyber, but we are not part of the Eurozone. Why should we adopt CROE framework, or what should we do cyber exercises? Why should we adopt the Tiber EU framework? The message I give from a regulatory perspective is pretty much straightforward. So first of all, it's the interest of actors in one industry to adopt one of the frameworks that probably is the most advanced. And luckily, CROE and Tiber EU in this case are 2 of the most popular frameworks that were adopted by many mature organizations. There are plenty of followers, plenty of others they are trying now to catch up and to please the regulators, of course. But also it's very, very interesting because we all have a common problem. So we have proliferation of good practices, proliferation of standards, proliferation of cybersecurity frameworks, and there is always a concern: what should I choose first? What should I put in place in my organization? What should be the best practice I should adopt? And here there are 2 different angles that I would like to share with you. On one hand, you have the regulators that are coming from the financial sector. The national banks typically, they are not cybersecurity authorities. They are financial sector authorities. And they struggle a bit with what framework they should recommend to you guys, to the industry, in order to be adopted, what kind of best practices they should recommend. On the other hand, you have national level cybersecurity authorities like myself, like my organization. We claim and we are quite knowledgeable, and we have a lot of good information and good practices to share and to recommend to everyone, whatever the industry. But of course, we are not specialized in the financial sector. So you have these 2 groups of regulators that are struggling about recommending good practices, pushing best frameworks to the operators, to the market. From the market, you also have a lot of, let's say, expectative and reluctance, because everyone considers if I move one direction and I start adopting all the way ISO 27000 or NIST frameworks or MITRE ATT&CK or whatever other frameworks, everyone thinks in terms of do I spend properly my resources? Is my level of security increasing properly? And so on and so on and so on. Now, one message I wanted to convey to you, because I had conversations and deep dive discussions with financial market regulators, with national banks, with other cybersecurity national authorities. The rule of thumb here is very simple. We'll try to promote and to recommend and to advise that everyone tries to adopt frameworks that are, first of all, generally accepted. What is already advanced and in place will not change. We leave it there. And this is one of the reasons I see it in multiple geographies, in multiple countries. Regulators, whether they are from financial sector or national banks or cybersecurity authorities, they expect that frameworks that already exist and are relevant for the industry are adopted. End of story. In some cases, what they do typically, they use local law in order to apply fines in extreme cases, fines, penalties, threaten to cancel licenses in the case those good practices are not adopted. In other cases, they choose to go for practically ongoing audits. That is, as we all know, quite time-consuming and resource-intensive, and no one likes to be audited at the end of the day. So one good, I would say, common sense solution to be adopted by everyone is carefully consider existing best practices, frameworks like these ones that we're going to talk about today, especially if your organization is an organization that has operations in multiple countries. Because there, whether Eurozone or non-Eurozone, a regulator will expect you to have a common level of maturity, a common, let's say, at least minimal baseline for security, for cybersecurity. So that's a clear trend. That's what I'm talking to the banks in Romania when I talk to them about cybersecurity. And the ones that come first and say, hey, we adopted already this framework or the other framework, and we try to comply with it to build the levels of maturity that are required by the framework. These are the ones that, let's see, have a pleasant conversation with me and with mine. Next slide, please. Okay. So in terms of timeline, as you may know, basically today, what is the current status? What is the current state of play? Especially for financial sector organizations that are in Eurozone, it is expected from a regulator perspective, now I put my regulator hat, it is expected that, first of all, you and your teams and your entire organization is aware of the existing frameworks, and if not yet, there are clear steps taken in order to be compliant, to be in line with those frameworks. So that's something that most likely you will hear all the time from European Central Bank, from the national banks in the Eurozone, from national banks from countries that are not yet in Eurozone, but politically they want to join the Eurozone sooner or later. And also you will hear it more and more and more from national cybersecurity authorities like myself that have to choose and have to recommend a good practice framework that is specific for the financial sector. And of course, no one wants to become a standardization authority and invent frameworks. The easy way for us to go, it's really pick up what is already in place, what is already adopted, and recommend it as a baseline. So please don't forget that time when awareness about those frameworks was encouraged and published and communicated, and a lot of actions in that direction were taken by everyone. That time is a bit past, is passé. Now, what happens? National banks, regulators, national cyber authorities started doing all kinds of inspections, audits, checks, cross-checks, validations in order to prove or to test a bit, to sense whether the banks or payment providers or others in their geography, their jurisdictions, whether they already comply or already they are more or less aligned with those frameworks. So it's a lot going on. It's a fact that this effort from the regulator perspective will only intensify because we also need to produce results to show the picture for the financial sector at country level, if you talk about country, or at least the sector level. But there is more and more and more regulatory pressure on this. There are a couple of good students that I'm aware of. I don't want to give names of organizations, but I was impressed about how fast and how mature they become. But we have to acknowledge there are many other actors in the financial sector that are kind of lagging behind. The good news is that they have a lot of, let's say, accelerators available. There's a lot of knowledge in many countries, in the market also with consultants, but also with national banks that can help them to accelerate. But the time is running out, and what I see in many countries, there is more and more pressure from the regulators in order to make sure that the minimal it's achieved. But regarding what are the levels and what are the expectations from a regulator perspective, from the, let's say, in the view of those frameworks, I invite the colleagues, the people from BDO to walk you through this.
Okay, thank you, Dan, for these clear insights. Let's have a look maybe now at the specifics of the CROE framework. CROE, it was definitely not the first framework on cybersecurity. There are many other frameworks around there and many sets of best practices that you can find. A key strength, though, of the CROE is that it takes these other existing standards into account. With CROE, the ECB provided overseers with a comprehensive set of expectations to assess their FMIs regarding the actual implementation of the guidance on cyber resilience, which was published in 2016. For the FMIs, on the other hand, the CROE should serve as a reference with detailed steps to gradually but continuously increase their cyber resilience maturity. And last but not least, the CROE is intended to serve as the basis for a risk dialogue on cyber resilience between the FMIs and their overseers. If we look into the concept, then we see that the CROE framework, it exists out of 8 different components. So 5 primary risk categories, which are represented by the wheel, and you have 3 overarching risk components. So the CROE establishes 3 levels of expectations, or maturity levels, if you want, starting from evolving, over advancing to innovating. Authorities will set the level of expectation for an FMI following the proportionality principle. This means that they will take into account several parameters that define the FMI and its role within the wider financial ecosystem. These parameters can include, for instance, the size, volume, or value of transactions. The selected level that is set by the authority is the Olympic minimum for the FMI. They should reach and maintain this level as a qualifying standard, and active steps need to be taken to reach the next level over time. This covers, in fact, an important element of the framework. The CROE framework is about a process of evolution and continuous improvement. An FMI should reach the level of expectation across all 8 categories of the framework. So, and once the FMI reaches and maintains this prescribed level, they should continue and evolve and improve by taking relevant steps to reach the higher levels. As the cyber security or the cyber threat landscape is continuously and rapidly changing, there is no end stage in cyber resilience. What might be considered today as innovating can become a basic measure in just a few years or even shorter period of time. And the CROE, it does not prescribe how to reach the expectations. So as such, the framework allows for flexibility in the ways that the FMIs implement the expectations. A key principle here is meet or explain, and it goes hand in hand with the golden advice, document, document, document. If we dig a little deeper into the different levels, we see at the evolving level that essential capabilities to deal with cyber threats applicable to FMIs are expected. Capabilities refer to people, process, and technologies. The evolving level will require, for instance, that vulnerability assessments and pen tests are performed. When we look at advancing, more sophisticated implementations are required. For instance, at the advancing level, red teaming exercises are required. The innovative or the innovating level focuses on the complete ecosystem and on collaborating with external stakeholders, as well as implementing state-of-the-art security measures. At innovating level, for instance, the FMI would be required to have an in-house red team that engages with the internal blue team. It's a maturity model with levels which are designed to establish some dynamism, so no static requirements, but to foster a culture of continuous improvement. Of course, it's important to know to whom this framework applies. So the ECB has defined the initial applicability of the CROE to a limited set of FMIs. The Eurosystem oversight function expects that all prominently important retail payment systems and other retail payment systems that they reach and maintain the evolving level as a minimum, with active steps to evolve towards the advancing level. For SIPs and T2S, they are expected to reach and maintain the advancing level, also with active steps to go further towards the innovating level. Applicability of CROE for all other actors is at the discretion and judgment of the national central banks. And even if CROE is not or not yet applicable, it might still be worthwhile to consider the framework because of its added value in terms of clarity regarding cyber resilience. And also probably we will see some FMIs who need to reach the certain level under CROE, that they require their participants or service providers to prove that they as well are in line with certain levels of cyber resilience. So on the next slide, we used our understanding of the market just to depict a bit the theory that I just explained. So with the SIPs and of course other players that are under discretion of their local and national bank. So I don't know whether you recognize yourself, but I think this is clear. Now maybe then I give the word back to you because you mentioned already the inspections by the regulators, but maybe you can give some more explanations.
Yes, so actually, and I hope you can hear me well. Actually, there is a lot of oversight activities that technically started somewhere in 2019. As I mentioned a bit earlier, they are kind of intensifying. So it's more and more and more activity and work from the regulators towards the financial market infrastructure actors. One of the reasons being that the regulators themselves hired teams and experts and built the necessary capacity and capabilities in order to be able to exercise these oversight activities. Let's not forget it was not always the business of national banks to have strong, extensive cybersecurity teams, but now they have them, most of them. In other cases, they ask other authorities to do the work. But basically, this kind of oversight evolved starting from the self-assessment that was required to be performed in line with the level of expectation that the oversight authority has set. And as it was mentioned, the principle of either meet the requirements or explain the gap or explain the plan to be put in place in order to achieve the requirement. This was a very, very important element that the regulators are monitoring. Technically it's an audit. So of course, we all know the auditors, they always like evidence. They want to see documentation. They want to see proof that certain organization, certain FMI actor, it's implementing actually those measures in line with the CROE framework. And Of course, being an audit, being an inspection, actually, the regulators, the national central banks, typically, they want to do independent tests with their own inspectors. So it's really a very strict and very elaborated inspection audit in most of the cases. And what I would like to say, like for any audit, you can imagine there are always findings. So expect that if you'll be subject or if you are already subject of those inspections audits or audits, will be always findings. As you know, I was an auditor myself. Stephen was an auditor as well, and he's still an auditor. Auditors are never happy if they don't have findings. So will be findings, but of course, the most important is to have findings with minimal impact with regards to your level of compliance with the CROE framework, or to have a very good plan, a very good action plan in order to close the gaps and close those findings. Next slide, please, because we are talking about findings. Actually, most of the findings are common sense, and I'm pretty sure that if you look at those that you see on the screen, you're not going to be shocked because they are common pain points for almost everyone in the industry, starting from lack of testing, because many organizations, they started having a pretty good, while high-level cybersecurity strategy, but they don't validate it sufficiently internally. So in most cases, it's a nice piece of paper, but they don't really walk the talk. So, and the auditors, the regulators, as you can expect, they catch that immediately. The moment when they say, prove me that you really implemented it, and boom, they have the first finding. In other cases, it's called that we observe lack of awareness and training all across the organization, so all levels. But some of the findings are really some of the serious ones, like inadequate or lack or insufficient response capabilities from a cybersecurity perspective. So really the capability to respond fast and adequate to incidents, or to detect those incidents. Or in other cases, it's more common related to the user access management, logical access management, which is in many cases not adequate or weak, simply because of the complexity of the environment. So the more complex your IT architecture and the landscape of systems you have, of course, the higher the probability that will be some inconsistencies, will be insufficient segregation of duties, inadequate access management, and so on and so on. So these are typically very, very common. In other cases, one of the pain points that is detected by the regulators during those audits relates simply to the inadequate or ineffective management of the detected security risk. So basically, the organization knows that they have problems, they identify their risks, and their risk management teams, they do quite a good job in interacting with IT, with security, in order to list the IT security risks, but they are not addressed. So they stay as a list of risks known, acknowledged by the management, acknowledged by everyone, but for a variety of reasons. In some cases, lack of resources, lack of priority, lack of support from the top. They are still not addressed. Be aware that now regulators, and I speak as one of them, they ask more and more questions about those risks, whether they are identified, whether there is a plan, there is a clear schedule for addressing them. And I must acknowledge, in many cases, what blocks financial market infrastructure actors or banks to address those risks, to address the issues they are aware of, the root causes are quite simple. So in many cases, everyone complains about lack of knowledgeable internal resources in order to do this. So basically, they don't have the specialists, they don't have the people that can actually do the implementation of the measures. And that's a common problem all over the industry. So everyone complains about the same. We cannot find them in the market. We cannot hire them fast enough in order to help them to improve our security. In other cases, it's lack of financial resources. Many organizations froze some of those projects, some of those initiatives. Coronavirus, to be very honest, did not help because some of them, they are waiting a bit to relaunch or to launch the initiatives. But I can speak as a regulator, we don't care. So regulators, they don't care about the economic downturn and about the fact that the revenue of the bank decreased or something like that. No, the message is very simple. We cannot afford to care about that. And we don't accept this as an excuse. I want to be very transparent and brutal with you guys. The speech I give to my banks, to the ones I talk to, or to the payment providers is very simple. Gentlemen, ladies, it's a cost of business. You have to do it. Economic downturn is not an excuse for poor security. It's more than that. We cannot put a price on solid security. And by the way, if we talk about risks, the reputation risk, it's something that we must be all aware of. So no such organization can afford not to be one of the best in class in terms of cybersecurity because of a little budgetary constraint, especially when we talk about organization acting in the financial sector. So quite a lot of findings. There are many others. We wanted to share with you some of the most popular, but as I said, I don't think you are shocked, you are surprised about those. So let's move to the next slide. And now it's with you, gentlemen, from Bedouin.
Yes, thank you for your insights, Dan. So now that you're a bit more familiar with the theoretical framework, I would like now to show you how this can be applied in practice with a more practical example. This example will showcase how you as an organization can get compliant with the CROE. The most important thing that I would like to emphasize is that the focus should be to leverage the existing cyber program that you already have in place. So do not start from scratch. The CRE is definitely based on best practice framework, so you should be able to leverage your already existing efforts. Typically, this is done in the first phase, where we would perform a gap assessment with the CRE framework to determine any required actions that you still need to take. This output will be used for phase 2, where a risk assessment will give you the necessary insights to establish a risk-based roadmap towards implementation and compliance. A detailed breakdown of each phase is made on the following slides. So this slide gives you an overview of all phases and the key milestones that should be achieved. Phase 1 can be considered as the preparation phase. You will build up your documentation, as Stephen already mentioned, and perform a self-assessment. It's essential to really build a strong case in order to minimize any additional imposements the overseer might have. In phase 2, the focus should be on prioritization. Use a risk-based approach to establish a feasible roadmap towards compliance. Phase 3 is a difficult part, of course, as always, the implementation. So getting all actions implemented in the required time frame and also obviously across all organizational units. This requires obviously strong governance structures. We would advise, as an expert, coming from an expert, we would advise not to wait for initial inspections by the overseer, but to rather start already now to avoid any pressure. We have seen files in the past where the inspection process has already started and the overseer has imposed their strict deadlines, like for example, that they need to answer in writing within 2 weeks. So we would advise to not wait for this inspection process, but already to start your preparation. Yeah, next slide, please. All right, so if we take a closer look at the readiness assessment, how would this work in practice? Well, your cyber resilience level is actually the driver that determines the CRE requirements. A readiness assessment has to be performed using documentation that already exists within your organization. Testing of the overseer will really drill down towards documentation. So it's not just checking your box with, okay, we have this in place, it's compliant, but it's really also having a body of evidence to demonstrate this. So that is actually a requirement. So it's not just a checklist, but it's really documentation. Yes, next slide, please. I've actually provided an example here how you can leverage existing efforts. So as you can see here on this slide, we've actually cross-checked the CROE with a well-known standard ISO 27K. As you see, a lot of topics are also imposed by the CRE, are also covered in ISO 27K, but there's definitely an extra layer on top of it. But this just shows that if you already have a cyber program or a standard that you comply with, that you should definitely leverage what you already have and not start from zero. But I think that makes quite sense. But it shows that it's really important to do so. Yes. Well, once that as-is assessment or that readiness assessment is prepared, we need to focus obviously on the to-be. Structured approach is required, where we typically start with a risk analysis to determine which actions are required following the readiness assessment and initial report of the overseer. In step 2 and 3, we will deep dive actually into these actions and risks to document thoroughly their implications. For example, okay, we have those risks, those findings on which organizational units do they have an impact, and what will our strategy be to address these actions. We advise at this point to already start the validation process with your overseer, because it's important to keep them already in a loop from the beginning as well, once you've done your preparation phase. Now, the final output of this phase will actually be an inventory of all your actions, prioritized and also assigned to responsible people. This can, at the end, then be translated into a roadmap for implementation and compliance. Again, here, touch point with your national bank is advised to have a final green light on the road ahead towards compliance. So please keep them involved from the start, I would say. Yes. Now, again, as already said, the final part is actually implementation, which is always a hard thing to do. But again, if you keep close interaction with your overseer and you define good the priorities, I think this should be feasible in a reasonable time frame, as long as you keep priorities straight and have a strong governance structure along your organization, then it should be okay. So this was the practical case. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Sam. I would like to wrap up with some key success factors. So first, it's about leveraging what you already have in place. So no need to start from scratch. The CROE is not in contradiction with any other cybersecurity standard. Secondly, you will need to convince auditors or inspectors of the regulator, so pay sufficient attention to proper documentation. Also spend sufficient time in understanding exactly the expectations to determine the roadmap. Understand that this is not this is a marathon and not a sprint. So there's no such thing as a silver bullet in terms of cyber resilience. And last but not least, ask for support of your regulator or external experts. We will now go into the Q&A. So Wart, please enlighten us on the questions raised during the presentation.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. During the presentation, we received some interesting questions from the audience indeed. I will choose some of them to elaborate on further right now. The first interesting question is the following. What do you expect of the consequences of non-compliance with CROE? For example, fines or losing a license? This might be an interesting question to be answered by Dan.
Yes, thank you for passing the question. First of all, I would say, of course, each regulator has a variety of measures in their hands, depending on their mandate, depending on the local law in the country where they have to act and they enforce their oversight. I can speak for Romania, but I'm aware of what others in other countries are doing. So one of the very first measures that we typically take and we do for the bad students, so for the organizations that are not really compliant or they drag their feet or they have significant delays without any plan to close the gap, the very first measure is a kind of continuous audit. So we send our inspectors and auditors on their organization much more frequent. So I'm aware of cases where auditors ended up every 2 months showing up at the reception of the organization in order to ask questions about the status. So this by itself becomes a very expensive exercise. Of course, next level of escalation, let me put it like that, it's fines. And there are many countries where the regulators are allowed to impose fines for non-compliance or for delays in remediation of the findings. And in more extreme cases, indeed, there is always the launch of the process to revoke a license for certain categories of financial services, starting from the payment ones. So I'm aware of cases where companies could be at the risk of losing their banking license or payment processor license and so on. So actually, audits, as I said, it's one of them. Second, fines, which could be very substantial depending on the country, and then actually the very risk of losing the license for parts of the business. So these are the typical ones that the regulators are using, and I must say also there is more and more popular amongst the regulators adopting stricter and stricter measures and more pushy measures.
Okay, thank you then for this clear elaboration. Following interesting question might be the following. Is the CROE aligned with the principle of agile? This might be an interesting question to be answered by Steven.
Yeah, thanks, Mart. So, yeah, the agile paradigm, it's not new, but for good reasons. The traditional players in the financial sector, they have not been pioneers in implementing the agile concept. Over the last years, however, we see a catch-up, and many actors in the sector are in the process of adopting the agile principles. This poses indeed a risk related to cyber security in the sense that many autonomous little cells or tribes or squads or however you call them, they will make decisions that might have an impact on the overall cyber risk posture. So one solution that I have seen is to have a dedicated cyber risk partner for the tribes. The CROE speaks about resilience by design, which needs to be embedded in the SDLC, so in the software development lifecycle. The cyber risk partner should ensure that the overall strategy cyber strategy is still respected. So I guess it's not in contradiction, but you need to pay attention to how you implement it.
Okay, thank you, Steven, for this explanation. So this was it for the Q&A part. I now give the floor back to Steven again for the final part of the presentation.
Yes, so we would thank you all for your valuable time. So we hope you found it interesting. We will be in touch with a follow-up email, and later this year we plan a webinar on Cyber EU. So Dan already explained a bit on it, or at least highlighted it. And so we hope you stay tuned, and we hope to see you again later this year for the next webinar. So have a nice day, and thank you very much.